Thank you all for being here today. So today I'm going to talk to you a little bit about what I like to call rhetorical bipartisanship, and that's bipartisanship beyond how members are actively working as legislators with one another and extends to how they're actually talking to one another. So I want to start with this example, which got really, really famous on social media. It's where Marjorie Taylor Greene said to a colleague, Jasmine Crockett, "I think your fake eyelashes are messing up what you're reading." And in response, Jasmine Crockett said that Marjorie Taylor Greene has a bleach blonde, bad built, butch body. And if you don't know what that means, it's a pretty negative insult she threw at Marjorie Taylor Greene, commenting on her hair, how it looks bad, her body, how it is unattractive. And just like there's been a lot of insults thrown around. But between these two and other members of Congress, it's not such an uncommon thing. One of my favorite videos going around the internet right now is Senator John Kennedy, compilations of him and all his fun sayings, which are actually pretty extreme if you think about members of Congress used to talk with such decorum. So collegiality used to be a norm in Congress. We know that members of Congress used to work together to produce distributive benefits for their constituents, bring home the pork. You help me, I'll help you. But now members regularly engage in this intermember conflict where they mock each other, make fun of one another, throw harsh insults. And they've just lost some of this collegiality that maybe we expect our representatives to behave a certain way. And I really think this matters for representation. Americans have this increasingly negative view of Congress and have lost a lot of trust in the institution. I mean, it's always been low, but it's reaching historical lows. It seems like almost more and more every day now. And I argue that how members of Congress talk to one another signals how they plan to act as legislators. So I think how members talk can indicate their legislative style. So do they plan to be a party soldier? Do they plan to build bipartisan collaborations? And I really think this has developed into a new form of representation where we maybe before expected most of our members, definitely not all, but to engage with one another in a collegiate way where they are kind, they work together to produce legislation. This simply isn't true anymore. Members have a choice between whether or not they're going to be kind to one another or whether or not they're going to be mean to one another and engage in this really aggressive rhetoric when producing legislation. So my three research questions that I want to assess in this chapter are: what does hostile and agreeable rhetoric look like in Congress? How has the use of this rhetoric changed over the years? And what are the conditions in which members are more or less likely to engage in hostile rhetoric? And then I do have a fourth research question that I'm planning on adding, which is: what are the legislative implications for using hostile rhetoric? So when members engage in this type of rhetoric, are they actually impeding their ability to build co-partisan collaborations with one another and effectively produce and move legislation through the process? So, when I think about the strategic choices that members are making, I think about why members might engage in the use of agreeable rhetoric. And that is that bipartisan collaboration is critical for passing legislation. We have incredibly slim majorities in the House of Representatives and the Senate right now. You almost always need to have bipartisan collaboration, either at an original co-sponsorship, a co-sponsorship level, or just the votes to get any legislation passed, especially in the Senate. We also know that strong interpersonal relationships are predictive of collaborative efforts. So if you are friends with someone, even if they are an out partisan, that is going to make you work with them more on introducing legislation. We also know that negative relationships between members of Congress impede their ability to work together and produce legislation. So a book project I'm working on, we have some qualitative data where members of Congress, they say, even though we're the same party of Ted Cruz and Rand Paul, we just don't want to work with them because, quite frankly, they're assholes. We think they're not fun to be around, and we're not going to work with them to produce legislation. And I think we can all kind of relate to that. You wouldn't want to write a paper with a co-author who's going to belittle you or be unkind to you or treat you like you're stupid. These just aren't the type of people you want to work with. So members might be incentivized to use agreeable rhetoric or treat each other with kindness and respect if they want to engage in collaborative efforts. So if they want to be legislatively effective and move legislation, they have incentives to build connections and positive connections with other members of Congress. On the opposite side, there's also incentives to use hostile rhetoric. So we know there's negative affective partisanship in the US. The public regularly engages in hate for the out partisan. And most members represent safe districts in the general election. So they might be more incentivized to appeal to their most partisan constituents. So they're going to build this electoral connection with the citizens that are the most extreme and might be looking for this type of hostile rhetoric or yelling at one another. The example of the Jasmine Crockett example, most PhD students in political science, at least here at UNC, are very liberal. And they love Jasmine Crockett calling out Marjorie Taylor Greene. They think it is so funny and fantastic that she's engaging in this behavior. So it could make your partisan supporters it makes them happy to hear. They look for this type of rhetoric in Congress. And then finally, at an institutional level, members are also incentivized to make the other party look unproductive. If you're the minority party, you're not really incentivized to make the majority party look good, especially in these areas of slim majorities. You're going to try to make them look bad in order to help your own reelection chances. So to turn to the data aspects of this project, I chose to look in congressional committees, specifically House committees, because committees serve as the workhorse of the legislative process. Committees are the space where members can go to achieve their policy goals. Historically, committees are also a space where members need to genuinely interact with one another and build relationships in order to mark up legislation or move legislation out of committee. They really are incentivized to have FaceTime here with one another, speak to one another. And while committees are, we have the data on C-SPAN, people do look at them, people do watch committee hearings. They're somewhat more private to the campaign rhetoric and the combativeness and campaign rhetoric that we see nowadays, because committees are really a place where members have to work together if they want to accomplish their goals. And then finally, I think committees are a good natural setup for looking at how naturally collaborative environments and naturally conflictual environments impact the use of hostile rhetoric. So we know that there are more conflictual committees like the Judiciary and Oversight Committee, and we know there's more collaborative committees like the Appropriations or Armed Services Committees. So this is a good natural setup to look at what this rhetoric looks like in more collaborative or more conflictual spaces. So first, I categorize hostile versus agreeable rhetoric. So my broad definition and operationalization of hostile rhetoric is direct antagonisms towards other members. So this is really broad, but it can include insults, derisive commands, belittling, derogatory labels, accusatory remarks, mocking, rude comments. And these are all things I saw when looking through committee transcripts. And the classification that I'll talk about later on is going to use the tone behind this to help classify it. And then agreeable rhetoric signals cooperation, respect, and solidarity with other members. So this could be positively recognizing other members, fostering bipartisanship, general politeness, respect, compliments, building goodwill, some things that we maybe want our members of Congress to do that could also build good relationships between each member. So to answer research questions 1 and 2, I have thanks to C-SPAN, I have the general committee communications from the 111th through the 118th Congress. There's just over 7,600 of these communications, and they include temporal identifiers, so the time and year that this communication was made, and the text of the communication. Unfortunately, at this point in time, the data lacks demographic identifiers such as which member is talking, what committee it's coming from, and the topic that's being discussed. So I'm looking to try and identify those things in the data later down the line because I think they'll be useful. But I use this data to examine research questions 1 and 2. And then to examine research question 3, I hand collected the committee speech and hearing transcripts for the 118th Congress from 8 House committees. So I chose 4 collaborative committees: agriculture, transportation and infrastructure, armed services, and appropriations. And then 4 conflictual committees: the Judiciary, Oversight and Accountability, Ways and Means, and Energy and Commerce. At the document level, this is just under 500 documents, and I'll talk about this a little more when I talk about pre-processing, but I did break that up into chunks because documents can be thousands and thousands of pages long, and when I'm looking for hostile or agreeable rhetoric, I'm looking for that at a local level. It's going to be harder to pick up instances of hostile rhetoric at the document level. So first I pre-process the text into smaller chunks. I use approximately 100 tokens per chunk, which is hopefully going to roughly get at 2 to 3 sentences to have a more localized approach and understanding to what type of rhetoric is being used. And from this, I create vector embeddings of each chunk using OpenAI's small text model. So what a vector embedding is it's a numerical representation of text, which can help capture some of the tone and sentiment behind text. And then I go and I make embeddings of exemplars of what could exemplify hostile or agreeable rhetoric. So this could be rhetoric like the example at the front. Hostile exemplar might say she's got a bad built butch body. Hostile rhetoric can also include things like shut up or you're stupid. And then agreeable rhetoric is going to be things like I respect you, or I'm really looking forward to working with my colleague, or I think they did a good job passing this bill. So I have this list of exemplars that I also make embeddings for, and from there I calculate a centroid of the exemplar. So just a common embedding, like the central space of all the hostile examples and all of the agreeable examples. From there, I calculate the cosine similarity between each chunk of text and each hostile and agreeable exemplar. And then I take the difference between these two. So cosine similarity is on a 0 to 1 scale in this instance. So I take the cosine similarity to the hostile exemplar centroid and the cosine similarity to the agreeable exemplar centroid, and I subtract them from one another. And this difference is what allows me to see if a piece of text is closer to being hostile or closer to being agreeable. That being said, I also apply a neutral bandwidth of 0.05 here, which categorizes things as neutral. So if they're really not that close to hostile or agreeable, it's going to be categorized as neutral. And most of the text actually is categorized as neutral, but still a good number is categorized as hostile or agreeable. So the good news is that neutral rhetoric makes up a plurality of the rhetoric used by members of Congress, followed by agreeable rhetoric. So the pattern here is pretty much between 25 and 35% of for the proportion of text chunks is agreeable in Congress over time. We do see that it is somewhat stable with these instances of like deep falls in 2013 and 2019. Maybe the bad news is that hostile rhetoric has increased over time, which I'm sure is not shocking to anybody, but the proportion of hostile rhetoric in congressional speech has grown substantially over time. I did perform an OLS regression on this, very simple with the controls that I have at the moment, which is just majority party, and it is about a 0.05 coefficient, which is only half a percentage point a year, but that's pretty substantial if you consider over 20 years, that's going to result in a 10% increase in the use of hostile rhetoric. And then finally, I look within, so this is the second part of the data, the full committee transcripts. I look within these 8 committees and map their hostile to agreeable rhetoric. And every committee uses more agreeable rhetoric than hostile rhetoric, but committees that we consider conflictual, such as the Judiciary, the Oversight and Accountability hearings, have much higher use of hostile rhetoric than the Armed Services and the Appropriations committees. So I only have an N of 8 on this right now. I'm hoping to expand this data going back to the 111th Congress also. And very, very N of 4 preliminary results do indicate that there may be a pattern. So I looked at the amount of legislation reported out of committee compared to the amount of legislation given to committee. And for collaborative committees, so that would be Transportation, Agriculture, Armed Services, and Appropriations, an increase in hostile rhetoric does lead to a decrease in the amount of legislation reported out of committee. So going to expand the data, but there might be a pattern there that hostile rhetoric does impede members of Congress' ability to effectively legislate in these traditionally collaborative spaces. So some of the implications for this is that agreeableness is consistent, but it is unstable. We have these deep falls that lead to periods of very little agreeable rhetoric being used in Congress, and hostile rhetoric is growing. We do see an increase over the years of hostile rhetoric increasing. The implications for this is that hostile rhetoric might harm public trust in Congress. If you just see your members of Congress yelling insults at each other all the time, making the other party look worse, but also maybe losing some faith in your own party that this is how they're choosing to talk to other people. And then preliminary, but it could impede members of Congress' ability to legislate productively. They're not producing a lot of legislation if they're being hostile with one another, and they're not able to build the type of relationships that they need in order to move legislation through the process. So my next steps are to expand the data back to the 111th Congress. I also want to see if I can examine hostile rhetoric at the member level to see if things like majority party status, your party, your seniority impact how you use hostile rhetoric, and then maybe at the member level, if using hostile rhetoric leads to a decline in your co-sponsorships or your original co-sponsorships with other members of Congress. And then finally, I want to expand the data to analyze the implications of hostile rhetoric on overall legislative effectiveness for Congress. Thank you.
Thank you so much. As I mentioned at the top of our session, we're going to do this a little differently given some scheduling constraints from Bridget's teaching schedule, which is understandable. So we're going to go ahead and turn the mic over to Dr. Crossan to give some comments on this paper. We'll do the Q&A on this paper, and then we'll move on to Joan Bay's paper. So go ahead, Jesse.
All right. Thank you very much. Thanks to Bridget for this really interesting paper. I think it is in very good shape overall. And so a lot of my comments are going to talk about the broader project, which I very much get a sense is going to evolve into a dissertation, or at least some version of some portion of a dissertation. So I just wanted to offer my thoughts on both the sort of bigger picture of what you're after, but also how that redounds down to the actual measurement of key constructs. But overall, I thought it was really strong, very methodologically sophisticated. But I'm pretty short on time. I want to make sure you get some Q&A, so I'm just going to dive right into to some areas where I had other questions. So one premise of this paper is that, as you say, quote unquote, Congress is no different from other workplaces. And I think, in my opinion, that requires a little bit more motivation. In many ways, I agree. But in many ways, Congress is completely unique among all workplaces. So individual members are, quote unquote, hired and fired by 435 or 50 different bosses. They are actual job performance is at best tenuously related to actual behavior on the job. And perhaps most importantly, and the one I want to spend some time talking about, is that each of the members, I think, tacitly understand that theater can be helpful to them with each of their bosses. In other words, acting like jerks to each other on camera can be quite advantageous politically, as you point out, but that they all are sort of in on the game. They sort of all understand how it works. And that's important for a whole lot of measurement reasons. So as an example, you say, quote, agreeable language underpins successful coalition building in committee. When a member thanks colleagues for their input or yields time to a counterpart, they may accrue some sort of social capital needed to build bipartisan coalitions. That might be true. I don't know that we right now have evidence of this effect. I think if all parties understand that incendiary remarks are part of, quote unquote, the game, that they can brush this nastiness off as just politics. And I just want to, I appreciated the interviews you were talking about. I know which Jason has mentioned those interviews, as Dr. Jason Roberts has mentioned, similar conversations. This is distinct from saying we don't want to work with Ted Cruz because he's an asshole. Ted Cruz is one of the few politicians who is both an asshole in person and on camera. But there are many politicians who play the game. In other words, they're jerks on camera, but are very collaborative behind closed doors. And in fact, there's sort of this perverse way in which hostility can provide political cover for being collaborative with someone while erstwhile being an enemy, supposedly being an enemy. And I think the most famous example of this is Tip O'Neill and Ronald Reagan. Tip O'Neill once called Reagan, quote, the most ignorant man to ever occupy the White House. I suspect that would code as hostile, according to your metric. To which Reagan responded, well, that's just old Tip. So that would be an example of those two playing up how much they hated each other, but then having a beer and talking through and negotiating on things behind closed doors. So a few things about measurement. So that's sort of like my big picture. Mostly that is that's a front end framing thing. I actually think rhetoric matters for a whole host of other reasons besides legislative productivity. That's not to say that it can't predict legislative cooperation. I could be easily convinced of that. But even if that's not true, people take cues from elites in the same way that you say, and that's bad for the civic health of the country. So we should care about this on its own, not necessarily because it has an instrumental, it does or doesn't have instrumental value. So I just wanted to point that out, that there's reasons for us to care about this, even besides the legislative process. Okay, so measurement questions. You said and I think you're right from a measurement perspective, that hostility is locally expressed, but I do wonder the extent to which sarcasm can obfuscate hostility. Word embeddings address some of this, but you could imagine sarcasm, which, as I write here, members of Congress have in spades, can make hostile remarks sound okay and okay remarks sound hostile, depending on what the context is. I could be totally wrong about that, but an example or two to disabuse me of that concern would be useful. More important to the text itself, though, as you continue even outside the context of this chapter to hone in on this measure, I worry about the extent to which you are picking up on the controversial nature of the underlying issues rather than the hostility of the chosen rhetoric. So, some issues are inherently more polarizing than others, and the use of more hostile language could just be, a function of the nastiness of the actual issue. At the very least, less cooperative language. And you're nodding, so I think you know exactly what I'm talking about.
It
You
was a
address
big
this.
concern.
Yeah, so you address this sort of in figure 3, but it almost underscores for me why you should be attuned to this, right? Because there are clearly some areas where it's just naturally there's more hostility, and some areas where there's less. It could be because the people in those select into those committees because they're jerks, or it could be something about the underlying issues. I don't know that I have a great silver bullet for that. There may be a way to jointly scale what the sort of jointly topic model the text as you work with the measuring hostility. But even absent that, what I think you could do is standardize by measure. Why is my hand up? Did you put my hand up?
No, I think you have automatic
You,
gesture recognition turned on.
Oh, for goodness sake. Okay. I think at the very least, you could create topic models for individual speeches and then standardize how hostile the remarks are given the whatever that measured topic is. And so, like how far above mean for immigration was this person in hostility? How far above mean were they for abortion or whatever the other topic is? So very cool project with tons of promise. I really like it a lot. The connection to LES scores is obvious. But I think there's even more connections to things like, are you embroiled in a primary election campaign? And does that make you, more hostile? I know primary elections and early stage stuff is all the rage in the UNC political science department right now, or at least all the rage with Sarah. And certainly all the rage here in the state of Indiana. So I think there's great connections there. You can also imagine the extent to which inflammatory campaign rhetoric carries forward to the legislature. That would be super interesting. So tons you can do with these data. I like them a lot. I'll end with a C-SPAN comment because this is the C-SPAN conference. If I'm understanding correctly, some of your transcripts are from C-SPAN, but then others are from the record. Is that right?
yeah.
So I would be interested to see whether the televised committee hearings are more hostile than the non-televised ones. If they're not, whatever. If they are, that sure would be interesting. All right. That's all I have. I'll send you some written comments that basically summarizes what I've given you here. But it was really a pleasure to read. Nicely done.
Thank you so much, Jesse.
Great. So Robert has a question. So I'm going to hand it over to him. Go ahead, Robert.
Yeah, this follows up on Jesse's last comment. I watched very recently the Rules Committee where where Frost says that Republicans really want to have babies so they can be killed by guns later. And anyway, there was a big debate about whether to strike his words. and they agreed not to strike his words because he wanted them to be in the record. So that's one thing to keep in mind if the official record would be struck by a motion. So anyway, this has nothing to do with what you're working on, but I'm struck by the book Jesse, who wrote called the Gingrich Senators, and whether any of this,
Sean Theory.
yeah, it passes over to the Senate when hostile, when members like, oh, what was the Pennsylvania and
Rick Santorum.
moved over to the Senate, but that's a project for after this one. Very good, good work.
Thank you, Robert. That's really I really am into like looking at both chambers. Bryce, if you read my master's, you would know that I do that there. Um, I I wanted to use the Senate for this, but I was struggling because I also really wanted to examine committees, and the committee structure in the Senate is just it's not the same. And I wanted to keep it consistent, but that's a great suggestion. Thank you.
Awesome. So I want to try to keep us on schedule. I have some comments and questions that I'll send to you via email. I'll just say one quick comment is that the what Jesse said about the workplace framing. I don't know if you've seen my political analysis piece about members of Congress mingling on the floor. But the original front end of that, when I sent it to APSR, was all about Congress as a workplace, and it got absolutely skewered by reviewers. And so, like, I
I was
completely
not a
readjusted
reviewer.
it. And so, like, yeah, so it's just a tough sell. This idea that like these kind of interactions that we're observing on C-SPAN have this like, it has a component, but it's you don't want to lean too heavily into like that type of metaphor. Now it's still in the paper, but it's like trimmed down quite a bit. But certainly the external impact argument that Jesse was talking about is definitely a good thing to think about. But I'll send you more via email so we can kind of keep on schedule. So
Thank you.
so with that said, let me share my screen again. Let me make sure. Right, sorry. All right. So our second presenter is Jungbae An, who is a PhD candidate in political science at the Ohio State University, whose work sits at the intersection of American politics and political methodology with a focus on elite communication and congressional deliberation. His dissertation, called, unsurprisingly, Congressional Deliberation, examines how ideas and influence travel within Congress. Across project, he applies network science, natural language processing, causal inference, and field and online experiments to study shared issue attention, bipartisan coordination, and committee dialogue. He's affiliated with OSU's Institute for Democratic Engagement and Accountability, also known as IDEA, and is an active member in a number of other organizations at Ohio State. So please welcome Jungbae. Feel free to take over the camera whenever you want.
Hi, everyone. Can you see the full screen of my slide? Great. Thank you so much for the introduction. I'm Jungbae at the Ohio State University. So today's topic of my talk is committee expertise formation. And I will show you some analysis of a few House Select Committee hearings. So let's get started. So expertise of congressional committee. So expertise is an essential element of legislative institutions. In institutional models, expertise is conceptualized as non-partisan information. So using this expertise, institutions can make public policy making for the public good. And such institutional expertise can be built endogenously. For example, in a legislature like Congress, members can form committees with a certain degree of discretion to address various uncertainties about the issue. And this committee maintains its authority and discretion by providing the legislature floor with a set of high quality bill sets, enabling the legislature to make informed legislation in principle. And these models are based on the rational signaling, while these models work when the ultimate goal of the members of the committee is aligned and with institutional performance. But they can also malfunction when the goal itself is in competition. And this issue raises a lot of concerns in today's highly polarized Congress. However, we do not know how severe the competition or polarization problem is, or whether expertise formation is proceeding effectively even amidst concerns about polarization. Therefore, what remains is to directly verify the formation of such expertise. And that's the question I ask in this work. So the expertise formation process, so if there is only competition in the committee processes without learning from each other, then there will be non-consensus and non-information, and it is absolutely unsustainable. So we should assume some learning between the members. And this learning is found in the existing literature that it is from the status or the individual capability. So basically, majority party can diffuse their agenda by controlling the agenda by number, or the committee chairship, the chair or the vice chair can control those agenda and the decision of the committee per se. So this is what I call status-driven expertise formation, or some non-partisan but individual, highly effective and highly competent individuals can control and advance their agenda. So like highly legislatively effective members can advance their agenda with some individual capability, and it is empirically found. But what I want to see is that if these structural or individual capabilities only about the committee expertise, then it is also problematic in some sense. So can we actually see the mutual processes such as deliberation in this committee expertise process? And I've been thinking about how we can ask this kind of question and how we can test this type of question. And I derived some approach with diffusion of the information. So, and which is a part of my dissertation. I mainly examine in the floor speech, but I look at the committee hearings in this work. So the main hypothesis is those rhetorical diffusion happens in the committee process. So committee members can update their speeches by learning from the other member. So in this sense, they have to mimic or learn and reflect the others' signals, and this ultimately make some effect on the convergence of the committee as a collective. So in this process happens, if this process happens, then we can actually examine how this committee information is converged. The time goes by. So this committee process can be modeled in a series of diffusion of the committee member speeches. And as we see, so this diffusion can be only a reflection of the power structure or individual capability. So diffusion can be only from the committee leaders to non-leaders, or from highly effective members to ineffective members, or the majority party to minority party members. Or this rhetorical diffusion only happens within the party, which can be the party echo chamber. But we can also see if this rhetorical diffusion happens via various channels, especially in a mutual way, then we can say that it is it is followed by some deliberative process. So I use this data. I focused on the House Select Committee hearings in this version, but I plan to expand the data into the more recent Select Committee or the more wider setup committee hearings. So I look at the Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence, which was in 112th and 14th, and the Select Committee on Benghazi, which was highly polarized, and Select Committee on Energy, Independence, and Global Warming, which was in 111th. And these committees are a little bit different. Like, as I said, Benghazi, the Select Committee on Benghazi was highly polarized by party. And the Select Committee on Intelligence is about the national security issues. So information is pretty limited, but the learning is crucial. And the energy independence and global warming also relate into the complex scientific and economic debates. So they have to seek more information about the issues. And altogether, I analyzed 783 hearings. And each hearing, we have 2 to 21 members, mean number of 7.91 members. And I focused on three rhetorical dimensions here. So I measure some semantic content using the sentence BERT. And I also measure the topic probability using BERT topic. And I also look at the moral foundation reflected in the speeches. I use the moral foundation dictionary, which uses this 10 dimension of the moral foundation, so that we can specifically look at if such dimensions are driven by some specific dimension of the content. So I measure these three dimensions and I construct each network of these dimensions, so we can see the who is the central of these three dimensions. And I look at some group differences in this three-dimensional semantic networks. So each columns are the three dimensions of the rhetorical dimension. And the first row is the differences between the leader and non-leader. And the second row is the highly legislative effective member and low legislative effective members. I use the 0.75 as a threshold. So the high legislative effective members, highly effective members above the third quarter of the distribution of the legislative effectiveness score. And I also see if the Democratic and Republicans have some central of status. And as you can see, the leaders are in general the more central in this network, and highly effective members are also central, which is aligned with the existing findings. So if you have some individual or structural status, you are central in these semantic networks. But we cannot actually see the differences in between Democrats and Republican, while you can see a very little tiny the higher centrality in Democrats. But these are just the descriptive centrality. So you cannot see the actual formation of expertise, which is a sort of the cumulative centrality they can get through those processes of expertise formation. So I modeled and test this expertise formation process by causal diffusion model. So the diffusion is from Sj to Si prime. So Sj is a member of Congress signal, and S prime I is the next time signal of the other member. So which from this model you can see the social influences um, from the speech exchanges, and I divided each hearing through the 5 time period proportionally. And to identify this causal diffusion effect, I used the double negative control design, and I used the proper confidence interval to infer the right the results. And this is the result. So to look at which channels the signal has been diffused in these hearings, I used a subsample of different types of dyad. So as you can see in the legend of the figure, I only use the same party dyad, cross party dyad, and majority to minority dyad, and minority to majority dyad, and leader to non-leader, and non-leader to leader dyad, and highly effectiveness to less effective members, or the ineffective to the highly effective members dyad. And I colored the black for the significant result and the insignificant result in gray. And as you can see in the first column and third column, we can see various types of dyad have this significant effect, while you can see the very few significant effect in the middle column. And and only among the significant effect, this the average causal peer effect, which is the causal diffusion effects, are 0.09, which is about 4%, 4.5%. So when there is a signal of the other member, then the other member signal is more closer to the member who spoke earlier. And this diffusion is about like 4%, 4.5% more closer speech in research. And this estimation process is a bit technical, and I can get questions about that and the estimation of the result. But this level is by dyad and by time. So if you think about the networks of these connections and the repeated connection of the communication, then the convergence effect is not trivial. And lastly, we can see the very few significant effect in the HLZI, which is Select Committee on Benghazi, which is, as I said, very highly the politicized by partisan line. So we can descriptively infer that if the hearings are pretty politicized, and this information convergence effect is pretty inhibited. So I think we can understand the committee formation by diffusion and the limitation of such processes. So the takeaways. So discursive processes socially construct committee expertise. And the test of a speech diffusion model in terms of the causal diffusion model shows that committee utilizes the multiple learning channels, And expertise emerges from mutual interactive processes, not merely from the structural power of the majority status or the committee chairship or individual capability in terms of the legislative effectiveness. However, the highly politicization may inhibit this interactive expertise building process. So there are lots way to go. Maybe if I enlarge the data set and I can see more variation depending on the types of committees or the types of diet. But for now, I found this general, but the bigger picture. And that was about it. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much. I will turn it over to Dr. Crossan, and he can offer his comments, and then we can see if we have a few questions. And Bridget, you can obviously take off when you need to.
Right, unmute. All right. Well, thank you. This was another really interesting, excellent paper. The methods were extremely sophisticated. Again, just so much I think that could be done with the underlying estimation and data. And so my comments will be both on this specific draft, but also some broader questions I have about the measurement strategies and the sort of underlying assumptions of the perspective you're working from here. One thing I do want to applaud you on is I really like the normative bases that you of policymaking that you work through. I assume that that you have worked with Neblo at least a little bit in working that out, and I think it's really cool to see you citing intelligently good political theory and talking about the value of deliberation and the kinds of deliberation that are important. That being said, for someone who is not as familiar with this literature, the certain ways you're using words, you might want to change the word that you're using. And in particular, you talk a lot about expertise in this paper, but the way you're using the word expertise, I don't think is the way most people use the word expertise. When I hear expertise, I think someone with a degree telling me what the facts on the ground are, or something along those lines. And what you're really talking about here is something more expansive, something more like information exchange that would encompass things like lived experience or things like that we wouldn't necessarily call expertise. But in the congressional setting, especially a congressional reviewer on this work, is going to hear expertise and they're going to immediately think this is going to be a paper about witnesses. And this paper is not about witnesses at all. It's about member to member discussion, which I think is cool and interesting and important. But I think switching to something more like an information exchange frame or something like that would make your intervention a little bit clearer. Now, speaking of witnesses, I did wonder what role, if any, they're playing here. Is it possible that shared rhetoric between two members simply signifies that they're responding to the same stimuli? In other words, they're grabbing phraseology from the witness and arguing over or discussing individual portions of that witness's, testimony. In that case, they're not really, and they may be learning from each other. They may be parroting each other semantically or however topically, but it could be they're just picking up on a common stimulus, which is the witness. So I would be curious to hear your thoughts on that. In terms of, you use the term downstream diffusion a couple of times. The decision to omit shorter hearings raises two questions for me. One, I do wonder a little bit about selection here. I don't think it super matters in this chapter, but thinking about why committee hearings are shorter or longer, and whether it's related to your outcome variables of interest is important to think through moving forward. And I also, it seems to me, and I by the end of the paper, I sort of wrote these contemporaneously. By the end of the paper, it seemed pretty clear to me you're looking within hearing, right? You're not looking across hearings. And so I would be curious if members are if the trajectory of the way we talk about an issue changes across committee hearings, especially if it's a bill that gets multiple hearings or if it's a topic that gets multiple hearings. So, I'm not saying that the way we talk about something from, 1 year to the next is influenced, but if there is a set of committee hearings within pretty quick succession, I'd be interested in looking for rhetorical diffusion across those hearings, not just within. You do a fairly good job here, actually, of explaining what is a pretty complex measure. I felt like I understood it, but I think that I think some examples, some actual real examples would do you a whole heck of a lot of good. And this is advice that I get a lot. So I'm gonna pay it back by giving it to you, which is to say, what is an example, like from the data, of a member talking about the same thing semantically, topically, and morally, as another member? And all you do is go to your data and find high scores in each of those and say, here's an example. And here, I actually think in discussing the results, going back to examples would be really helpful. Give me an example of a Republican influencing the semantic choices of a Democrat. That would be super interesting. Give me, or even better, the moral choice, the moral framing between Republicans and Democrats, or of a lower level member affecting a higher level member, or whatever. I think this would be both interesting. They would also be informative and really getting your audience to getting their wheels turning about this and what actually is going on under the hood. From a measurement perspective, I would be interested to hear how we make sure that legislators are not just quoting their colleagues in order to disagree with them. So you could say, my colleague from blah, blah, blah said the following. I fundamentally think that's idiotic. In that case, there's going to be some text reuse. And I know what you're doing is not text reuse, but I could imagine a reviewer making that comment like, hey, these people mock each other all the time. How do we make sure that's not what they're doing? And I'm going to do something which I'm known to do, which is talk about graphics. You have a really complicated set of things to measure, and I actually think this graphic is a pretty good way to present your results. But I do have a few suggestions for how to present things a little bit more in a substantively punchy way. So one thing is like magnitudes in general. So to the naked eye, it was difficult to tell that the moral diffusion row was, quote, generally showed fewer significant results. I never would have guessed that looking at the graph. I had to read the text to know that. There's a way you could just even put summaries at the ends of the rows for the number of significant results. That would be great. Same thing goes for the individual actors. Which individual combinations, leader to non-leader, Democrat to Republican, tabulate, at least give me crosstabs, because, your hook for the paper is definitely the right one. Highlighting non-hierarchical and bipartisan diffusion is both interesting and worth explaining, but there's a lot of windup. And at the very end, you have the data, but you don't pitch it to us. You need to give us more, at very least, give us some crosstabs about how common these sorts of types of diffusions that we wouldn't expect. Like, how many times did they happen? That is in and of itself really interesting. And I'm going to conclude with a comment that is of a similar flavor to what I gave to Bridget, which you say, quote, these results underscore the enduring importance of deliberative spaces within legislative institutions. I think you're probably right. I think it is important to understand deliberative influences in light of our present polarized era. But on the other hand, what do we really know about how these speeches redound to things like legislative content, co-sponsorship choices? In other words, the nitty-gritty of what actually changes policy outputs. I suspect they probably do, but I wouldn't overclaim until we know what they do. And in the meantime, you can say things like they're modeling deliberation for their constituents, and that matters. End of discussion. That will not matter for this chapter, but as you go to publish this in the APSR and AJPS, you don't want to run amok of someone that's like, well, we don't know that. You're claiming something we don't know. I think we could show that. You actually set yourself up to be able to write those papers, but just be careful about what you're claiming on the front end in terms of what has been shown. Again, really good work. Sorry to use the last 8 minutes or whatever. I'll send you written comments, but enjoyed reading both of these papers.
Thank you so much. It's great.
Thank you so much, Jesse. I think we can take a question or two before we exit both the session and also the conference. So if anybody has anything, feel free to ask away. Sure, go ahead, Robert.
Um, 2 points. One is because Jesse talked about across hearings. Remember, this is select committee, so they're going to be focused on Benghazi, Benghazi, Benghazi. The second thing is, I'm not sure. Well, I'm not sure exactly why you chose select committees. And also, does the permanent select committee fit with the criteria? Because sometimes they call it permanent select because they don't want it to go away and they want to show a permanent feature to it, like a standing committee. So anyway, that's only on the committee type. So
Yeah, these are great. Yes, on the series of the topic, I mean, topics are pretty much related. And so yes, and Jesse and Robert, yeah, we'll do that in a future version. And the selection of the committee, yes, I selected the favor of my deliberative
mhm.
but yes, I really want to see these results hold in a different type of committees as well.
Mhm.
Yeah, the only comment that I would make about this project is that so I have another paper that's not this project, but it has like some underlying like methodological questions that might be helpful to you in terms of the review process. And so I need to get this thing back out, but this is like a paper that's been bouncing around like the review process through like the top three. And so in that paper, like methodologically, I do a similar move to what you're trying to do here, which is I have this big machine learning model, and then I have this like network diffusion type thing. It has nothing to do with floor speeches, but I found that when writing that, it's like a really challenging manuscript to write because basically it takes you so much time to get to ground zero that you end up talking to the results, like way down in the manuscript. And by that time, everybody's like, if they're not really in depth into the methodology, they get really confused about what you're talking about at that point. And so you lose the people pretty quickly. And so I would certainly recommend that. I mean, this might be a good opportunity for this particular book chapter is that I would think about just doing like the BERT topic modeling and all like the dictionary stuff, the BERT topic model, the BERT sentence stuff as like a chapter for our book. And then when you write your bigger paper about the diffusion process, then you can cite the book chapter as already having all the topics. So you don't have to explain what a BERT topic model is. You can just say, using the topics that were defined in this self-citation, and then you're off to the races when it comes to describing the network diffusion process, which is really kind of the innovative part of what you're trying to do with your paper. Otherwise, again, like you're just going to spend so much time talking about the BERT topic model that you're going to not get to this relatively kind of. It's not really. It's just like the challenge is that like network analysis is just not seen nearly as much as it was, X many years ago. So like you have to remind people about kind of some of the terminology and things like that. And so it's just a little bit more challenging at the front end of that. And so you don't want to start that discussion like, 10 pages in to your paper, 12 pages in. You want to kind of bring that up as quickly as possible so you give people time to marinate on the technique a little bit before you jump into kind of these figures that are very impressive in the sense that like it's a hard concept to try to visualize. And so you also have to give yourself some pages on this like final manuscript on how to you have to sit on that figure for a while to explain it because like you're going to have to explain each point probably a couple of times around the figure so people can kind of read what you say, then look at the figure, and then they get to your next paragraph, read what you say, and then they can go back to the figure. And so you have to be prepared to dedicate that type of space. So if you don't do it for the chapter, I would certainly suggest like splitting it up moving forward, where you try to kind of move some of that topic components to you can either do it as an appendix or as like a separate publication so you can kind of quickly get to it. But other than that, it was a very interesting paper and project. So
Jungbei, I'll just say if you go that route, that gives you more space to draw out some qualitative examples of the different types of diffusion and topics and so on that you're discussing. And I actually think that highlighting that you detect pretty considerable differences across three committees is enough of a finding for the chapter, such that you have more space to describe the method, like Bryce said, for what that's worth. I do think examples will go a long way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, as somebody who's read a lot of methodology papers, I will say that one of my struggles as an author is that I try not to, like, not every methodological thing you do needs to be new and innovative. And so, like, because what happens is that if you do, my papers end up like, this one that I'm speaking to directly had like three different, like, interesting techniques, like all packed in the paper. And then by that time, like people are just confused about what it is that you're trying to highlight in the paper. And so I've tried to start dialing that back a little bit, or at least like dividing it up. So, cool. So we're a little bit over time, so we will go ahead and wrap up. So thank you so much for the fantastic papers and presentations. This concludes the chapter, the 2025 CCSE Research Conference. You can read the entirety of our proceedings for free online at the QR code here. We'll be in touch with the authors as we move towards actually producing the book chapters and the proceedings, the book chapters and the edited volume. As always, I want to thank my colleague and the faculty director of the CCSE, Dr. Robert Browning, who, if it wasn't for him, we wouldn't be having this research conference because he hosted it way back when. And so thank you to him as well. So with that, I will conclude the conference, and thank you so much. Take care.
Very good.